Welcome back to Itch.io Deep Dive, the series where I recommend indie horror games that I found on my recent expeditions. This week I'll be covering some winter-themed horror, psychological horror loops, escape rooms, and a Twitch stream gone wrong. Without further ado, let's get started. There's a real scarcity of good Christmas horror games. I once considered doing a special Christmas Itch.io deep dive, but I couldn't find enough that was worth talking about. What I wanted was more games like the Not Dear Stew by Roar Video Store. While it is February by the time this video goes up, it's still miserable and cold in Ireland, so I think it fits the season just fine. Snow rests heavy on the woods of Timberholt. Something lives in these woods. Not an animal, not a man. It feeds on any who wander too far. Today is Christmas Eve. An old man returns to the woods, just as he has every year. He follows the old recipe, the one they call the Not Dear Stew. This is all the exposition you get before you're dropped into the game. Pressing tab opens your journal, which reveals each step of the recipe as you progress, starting with lighting the fire. One thing you'll notice from watching the footage is that this game is very minimalist. Beyond your journal and the little dot that acts as your crosshair, there's very little UI. The game also has some nice letterboxing that makes it feel that little bit more cinematic. This lack of clutter, combined with the retro graphics, makes it feel like quite a serene game at first. After all, you're just collecting firewood and vegetables. What could possibly be so scary? Of course, after walking a little further into the forest, you start to notice that things are off. The ground is strewn with bones, and there's a strange stairway to nowhere. Other than the radio you can choose to turn on, the game has no music, forcing you to listen to the sounds of the forest as you collect what's needed. Some sounds are completely natural, footsteps on snow and wind, but others are not so natural. Naturally, once you've prepared as much as you can, it's time to acquire the meat. It's called Not Dear Stew for a reason. The Not Dear Stew is a folk horror story, but it also has that element of creepypasta and skinwalker stories that are prevalent in certain corners of the internet. The stairs in the forest immediately made me think of that famous photo of the Forest of Dean stairs that inspired a lot of internet urban legends a few years back. Overall, the Not Dear Stew has an incredibly creepy atmosphere, walking that line between peaceful nature game and creepy folk horror really well, despite being only about 15 minutes long. The final section of hunting the Not Dear is surprisingly difficult, as it doesn't want to go down without a fight. The way to trigger the fight is very clever, forcing the player to turn away from the woods and only turn around once the Not Dear has started sprinting towards you. It's a great way of forcibly building tension as you play chicken with this monster. Once you do get it in your sights, each bullet you fire completely fills your screen with smoke, which makes it hard to tell if you've even hit it. Hunting the Not Dear isn't simple, and you'll find out it has a few tricks under its sleeve. All in all, it doesn't overstay its welcome, and it's a perfect little horror game for these winter months. Do you remember when PT first came out and kind of ruined horror games for a while? It happens occasionally where one game explodes and is so popular that every indie developer suddenly decides to base their game on that without actually learning what made it so effective in the first place. Nowadays, loop games aren't as popular as they were, say, 10 years ago, but they still pop up occasionally. Elevated Dread by Underground is a loop game at its core, and it has a lot of the same flaws that they tend to have. When I say loop game, I mean quite simply a game that takes place in some sort of repeating setting a la PT. In this game, you play as a kid who's making money by putting posters up to advertise a Halloween party, and you only have one more apartment building left before finishing. Once you enter the building, the door locks behind you, and a strange static screen blocks you from using the stairs. After putting posters on all the doors on the first floor, you enter the lift and head up to the next one. This is your basic loop. A floor with the same number of doors as things get progressively weirder around you. The problem with this game, and a lot of games like it, is that the escalation isn't paced very well. Typically you want the first few floors to feel relatively normal, to pull the player and their character into a false sense of security, before showing them the monster. In this game, immediately after finishing the first floor and heading into the lift, the game shows its hand by having the monster walk past the crack in the door. This is the kind of reveal that should be saved for floor 3 or 4, once you've gotten into the groove of placing the posters on the doors and you've heard a few creepy sounds. However, this isn't to say that the game is completely without positives. As you continue up the floors, things start to get stranger and stranger. TVs start playing weird old school ads and disconcerting family videos, and some of the doors are left open. One particularly good moment happens when you get off the lift at floor 8 and spot something in the distance behind an open door. It's just far enough away and just blurry enough to be missable at first, but it's unmistakably some sort of monster. These more subtle scares are much more effective than the loud screaming jump scares that inevitably occur at the end of the game. Ultimately, I think that's the problem with these kind of games. There's only really one or two ways you can end it. Either your character escapes and it's a bit of an anticlimax, or they get caught and you do a big puppet combo moment. In order to do the escape style of ending, you have to be confident that your story is compelling enough to carry the experience, and a lot of these games tend to go for the psychological horror approach. Someday I'll write a full video on the pros and cons of psychological horror, but there's a reason it's always the route chosen for mediocre indie horror games. Rather than telling a story directly, you can kind of just throw a lot of nonsense together and say it doesn't make sense because it's psychological horror. This isn't true for all psychological horror. In fact, I think when done right, it can be the most compelling subgenre of horror. Unfortunately, this game falls very much into the mediocre category. By the end of the game, it goes full layers of fear and starts doing the hallway disappearing behind your back trick, leading to a reveal that doesn't feel earned. Back to the gameplay for a moment, another thing that feels strange is that the monsters never really interact with the player. They appear in the distance or when you're in a safe location, but they never actively chase you, which is weird because some floors have hiding spots that you can get inside of. Maybe my playthrough was just bugged and I was meant to get chased, but it feels like the hiding spots were placed there to trick the player into thinking the game was more interactive than it actually is. I think Elevated Dread has some good moments, and I would be interested in seeing what this dev could make with a bit more time and effort, but I feel like the lack of originality kind of kills any positive feeling I have about the game. I would encourage the developer to keep trying though. I'm sure you've got a decent horror game in you. It's been a while since I've played a good escape room game. I'm a huge fan of the Zero Escape series, and a couple of years ago I covered a game called Blank Frame, which I really loved. Kitchened by Koro Games is a very short little game jam game where you play as a character who's been trapped inside their kitchen and has to seek a way out. There isn't really a story. You're standing on your balcony enjoying a cigarette and a coffee when you turn around and are knocked out by an unseen person. After waking up, you find that your kitchen has been turned into a deadly escape room. Visually, the game is very playful. When you change direction with WASD, the camera kind of bounces back into place, and your mouse controls your character's hand. It's very simple, but it makes the game a lot more enjoyable to control than you typically find in these kinds of games. A lot of them tend to be kind of stiff. The primary goal is to escape the kitchen, but the door has no doorknob, so that should be your first priority. There are a number of locks to get through, and all of them require solving a puzzle to get the code. On the kitchen table, there's a plate of eggs and a jigsaw puzzle. Most of the puzzles don't require much thought. This isn't exactly Blueprints, but you do have to solve all of the puzzles in one go. Each time you die, maybe from snipping the wrong wire on a dynamite trap, or getting your face blown off with a shotgun, you reset back to the balcony. Speaking of shotguns, one thing I didn't really like about this game is how many instant death traps there are. The first time you open a cupboard and get blasted, it's a fun little surprise. But there are, I think, 5 different shotgun traps. It basically means that half of the kitchen is unnecessary to the puzzles, and it really narrows down how much complexity there is. I imagine this was done because it was for a game jam. Any unused drawers and cupboards were just converted into death traps, or maybe the developer just has a sick sense of humor. I don't have any criticisms other than that. I'd love to see an expanded version of this game with a bigger environment and more in-depth puzzles, because the bones of it are pretty good. Like a lot of game jam games, the ending is pretty anticlimactic, so bear that in mind if you decide to play it.
User 87,538 says, washed up streamer, LOL.
I'm always on the lookout for games that try to do something different with the medium, and Project Subathon Urban Explorer by Togue Productions absolutely fits that bill. The game follows a washed-up live streamer named Piejaw, who went viral years previous for finding a real ghost on stream. However, the algorithm is a fickle thing. and now 3 years later he finds himself streaming to very little fanfare. So he decides to do one last ditch effort for attention, and investigates rumors of a mansion in the woods containing a red door. With nothing to lose and everything to gain, he decides to livestream his visit. You would be forgiven for thinking that you play as Pyjaw in this game, but the truth is much more interesting. Instead of controlling the streamer himself, you play as a member of the chat. Your controls are issued through simple commands, kind of like a text-based adventure game where the main character has some autonomy over what he does. Pyjaw walks around the room he's in looking for notable items, and you can steer him towards certain things by typing about them in the chat. If you type something that's not in the game's library of accepted phrases, he'll ask you to repeat your message in a way he'll understand. The game has only been out for about a week, and it was made for a game jam, so obviously keep all of that in mind while I discuss it. Project Subathon has such incredible potential as an idea, and it's impressive for what it is, but it is incredibly janky. The developer recommends that you don't type while Pyjaw is walking to something, because it can mess with his pathing. But unfortunately, he seems to walk almost constantly. He doesn't stop long enough for you to think of a new command, so a lot of the time you have to paste in a message quickly or just spout specific words. If you could spend more time getting into the role of a chatter and actually typing full sentences, it would feel more authentic. But that would also require Pyjaw to stand around doing nothing while you think. The benefit of him moving around all the time is that he feels more like an authentic streamer, and in that way the game is a success. All the stupid faces he pulls in the face cam when he comes across something strange, combined with his dialogue, really sells the kind of character he is. Anyways, back to the gameplay. Your goal as the chatter is to discover different topics that you can send to Pyjaw to discuss. Apparently there were 52 in total, but I'll be honest and say that I didn't discover nearly that many. You're also able to turn the game speed up, which helps if you're stuck in a particularly long loop and need him to reset. As Pyjaw moves further into the mansion, he'll start gaining more viewers, and the chat becomes a lot more active. While this is a nice feature, it starts to get a little bit repetitive after a while, which I guess is pretty accurate to a real-life Twitch chat. Chatters mention that there are stories on Reddit about a murder in this building, and they tell Pyjaw to watch out for any wild dogs or squatters that might be roaming around. I will admit that this wild dog room broke pretty badly. I needed Pyjaw to look at the red key at the end of the room, but I had typed too many commands, which led to him walking around the room about 3 times before he finally moved in the direction I needed. If you do decide to play this game, I recommend being patient and only typing things when you're confident you know what you need him to do. This is definitely more of a proof of concept than a full game in and of itself, but I wanted to highlight it because I think it's a fantastic idea. A longer version would require a lot of work in regards to troubleshooting and making the interactions feel more fluid, but I would really love to see it someday. In a lot of ways, it reminds me of Lifeline on the PS2, where you control the main character using voice commands. There's a long history of strange control methods in games, and I think adapting an adventure game format to the modern internet is a genius idea. Definitely give this one a try, and keep an eye on this developer. I would love to see them do something more with this concept in the future. Thanks for watching. As always, all the games I discussed are linked below in the description. If you haven't already, please consider liking this video and subscribing, as well as subscribing to my second channel.